I'm going to make sure to record this, genius. Would be very silly. Okay, so now we're starting again, chapter 9. So 3 trends to shift to a service-based economies over the last 50, 60 years, the globalization of markets, which require or have their own unique difficulties, and then the growth of the e-commerce channel, growth of the e-commerce, which we'll talk about very specifically in the multi and the omni channel. So we know what has happened. Remember, we talked about the service supplied has been greater or less than the service demanded. This push has required consumers to find alternate ways in which they themselves can avail themselves to the goods that they want. And so we've watched the market and technological-based disruptions have created this unique situation that we're in. And the difficulty is that they're many times difficult to predict. And so what we're hoping to do is, instead of thinking of the specifics, but think generally in 3 major trends, which seem to be continuous and ongoing. And so let's first talk about services. We're going to go over a lot of the ideas that you probably learned way back when in principles when we started talking about products, but we're going to talk about services in a much more specific way. We're going to talk about how services have created this drift from the mere manufacturing of products to the actual output of services. And so the example that the book brings up is Emerson. So Emerson was the maker of reefers, which are refrigeration products for grocery stores. No, it's not what you think. Emerson decided that the making of reefers was not the best thing that they could do for their business. And why? Well, think about it. Refrigeration equipment tends to be seasonal in nature. It also meant that their salespeople were focused on the bottom line at the end of every month to make sure they hit their quotas. And the difficulty with that is that when you target fascinate on an individual month, it means that you will rob from the next month to give to this month. And so what did Emerson do? They decided that they were going to buy back all of the refrigeration equipment they had, and then they were going to lease the equipment along with warranty contracts, which also included scheduled maintenance, which was a brilliant idea. Because Emerson refocused their business not on the products they sold, but to the consumers that they sell to. That's what marketing is supposed to be all about. It increased their sales and their profits. Sure, no problem. They dealt directly with their end users. Their end users had a much satisfactory product. It meant that instead of having to miss a scheduled maintenance because they just simply didn't have money, that the money was in essence built in. And if you look at the core of what Emerson did, and you ask yourself, what are the service or what did Emerson provide to their consumers? You could actually say that they provided the confidence of knowing that their products were going to be safe. The goods that they sold to their consumers would be protected in refrigeration. And so this is an example when the drive to shift to services is ultimately a drive to satisfy the consumer's requests. And so let's kind of review what a service is. But before we do that, let's talk about this whole concept that comes back from chapter 1, and this is the concept of disintermediation. I said we'd visit this way back in chapter 1, and here it is. The shift to services also can be coupled with disintermediation, and this is where channel partners are taken out of the chain and the manufacturers sell directly to the consumers. This means that the suggested list prices that they sell, instead of it being chopped off in some way because they're going through an intermediary, they're going directly to the consumer. They gain multiple benefits. There is less performance ambiguity. They know how their consumers are feeling and understand their need for satisfaction. And so this is the slide I wanted to get to. Even McDonald's sells services. McDonald's doesn't necessarily sell products. Does anybody use the McDonald's app to order? Does anybody use the App Store? Okay, what do you use, by the way?
I use the McDonald's app.
Okay.
These other deals and everything.
That's the real thing, right? You get deals, huh?
Oh, yeah.
That's it? Okay. Well, I mean, I have not used it. I'm a strictly drive up. Same thing as the deals that.
Yeah, I use Chick-fil-A service.
Okay, all right. Well, that's cool. Good to know. All of those, it's one, those are omni-channel, but two, realizes that they're doing that to provide an added service to the consumers. We're going to talk about what co-production is in a minute, but this is in a way in which the consumer becomes more engaged in the activity, and the consumer, by driving their own desires, creates value. And so let us talk about these four things that services are. The first that a service is it's intangible. A service cannot be touched or seen in the same way as others. Services cannot be inventoried and patented, but I'm going to kind of disagree with him a little bit with Palmentier on this, but this is the test question. Services cannot necessarily be patented, but services processes can be patented. So there was a noted hair designer of men called Jay Sebring in the 60s who came up with what was known as the feathered look or the Sebring cut. And he actually patented that way of cutting hair. So you don't have to know that. This is the good definition for the test, which is really what we're caring about right now. But services can't be inventoried. They can't be patented. They have no shelf life. A service is consumed at the moment of purchase. And services are highly specialized to the individuals. Services have an inherent danger because services are also very personal. Who in here has only one person that you allow cut your hair? Yeah, exactly. We all do. I'm going to go get one today. Yes, services are very personal to the individual, which also means that they drive the greater value, but they can also have the greater risk. They are heterogeneous, which means each one is unique. Products manufactured in a manufacturing line are highly controlled so that each product is exactly like the same. Does anybody know what Six Sigma means, really? You've heard it in supply chain. Anybody know what it means? Okay, quick definition. So here we are in marketing research. Dr. Alvinson teaches you, all right? There's the median. Anybody heard the word standard deviation? Okay, we know what that is. So one standard deviation, that's a sigma. That's one sigma, okay? That is 68%, if I remember Dr. Babin correctly, of all goods are within one standard deviation. 2 sigmas is 95%, if I'm right. Okay. And then three standard deviations is 4 in a million. And so when you add up all the sigmas, that's 6 sigma. That's all it means, folks. It's nothing fancy. But what it means is if you're studying 6 sigma, you'll have 4 failures or less in the making of 1,000,000 items. That's what 6 sigma means. It is an iterative process to correct errors. But services are very highly dependent on a very specific employee delivering a very specific service. And if I'm asking you this and you understand it, it means that people are not less important in a service economy, they're everything. All right. And it means that hiring employees become more important than ever. And because of this need to deliver service, there's the need also to eliminate intermediaries because you have the best chance of getting it right if you're more directly connected with the consumer. And so you see how these patterns fit together. All right. And so let's see if we got everything. They're unique. They're perishable. They are performance in use. In other words, you evaluate them in that moment. They're definitely non-durable. And this is that whole degree of co-production. The provider and the end user. Combine together to create the value of the service provided. And even I'm willing enough to tell my stylist to say, don't cut too much off the top, even though he does. But think about this also with service. So I wrote a paper with Dr. Albinson about the dyad between the trainers and the individuals. If I told a trainer, I want to get fit, well, what does that mean? Think about it. Fit in the last 100 years has meant corpulent, fat. It has meant muscular. It has meant thin. And now it means tone. All of those are interpretations. When I talk to my trainer and I say, I want to get fit, they each have their own ways of interpreting what fit means to me and how do I get there. And this is an example of what co-production is. When you go into your trainers or you go into teachers or your advisors and you're asking them, I want to get to this level, the person who is helping you is translating that in a series of actions that help you to get to that place. And so services require a high degree of connection, co-production. And because of this, traditional standard structures can't maintain. And so having these things together means that services require this connection together. And so we're rounding out. Services are intangible. They're heterogeneic, which means they're unique and different. It requires a co-production between you and whoever the manufacturer is or the producer. And so all of these come together with your thinking of where services are and ultimately how services have been created through the channel system. And so this is just part of the discussion that I talked about IBM. IBM decided in the late 2010s that they were no longer going to sell equipment. They basically were going to sell systems. And that's ultimately where they are. They, in essence, did very much like Emerson buying back their reefers. They bought back their equipment, did the same kind of licensing agreement. And now IBM, not talked about, is still one of the number one, especially when it comes to business machines in the world. And so they also bring the music retailers. What products did you actually have? You have music. And here, once again, if you're not purchasing a physical good, there's very little evidence that you need to provide that third-party retailer to be able to distribute those goods. Now, how do we gather knowledge? How do we work on service? Well, there's three ways of being able to acquire service capabilities. First off, test questions, the ones you're always going to ask. The quickest, fastest, and easiest is through acquisition. You go buy it, the bottom one. Apple decided they did not want to outmake Beats. They decided to buy the company. That's the way you do it. Which is a very rare thing for Apple. It's interesting, I was reading that Apple has now gone away from the Intel processor chip, which stuns me. And I've been talking about this for years. And so Apple is going to different processor chips right now because they're inventing, or they're, let's just say they're reinventing the whole process of the iPhones and their MacBooks, which is kind of amazing. And the way they're doing that is they're doing that in the middle one, which is collaboration. You select partners because of their unique specific capabilities. I wish I could remember the chip manufacturer. I'm lost at the moment. But they have worked closely with Apple in the creation of their own chips. And so this is where the next generation of iPhones and tablets are coming from. I always thought it was one of the, I have much more respect now for Steve Jobs. Not like I knew the guy, but I mean, I came up in the 80s at the same time as he did. And in 2007, 2008, Steve Jobs said, we will no longer use or build our own chips. We will use the Intel processor. And that is an enormous admission for an individual like Steve Jobs, who has a powerful ego. For him to basically say that someone can make chips better than us was a great admission, and ultimately what expanded the success of Apple for the next decade and a half. But then the last way, which is the way that most times Apple does things, is through in-house development. Apple targets 10% of its profits to research. Now think about that. $1 in every 10. Anybody got an idea how much Apple made last year? More than me. I think it's something like every year they throw $100 million to $200 million in research, and that's just incredible, just amazing to think about, just in the pure research. But they know where their future is, and their future comes from in-house development. Interesting story when iTunes came out. So if you ever get in my marketing strategy, I use iTunes as a very important marker because it says the essence of what Apple is. Apple, folks, is nothing about the products that they make, all right? All the machines that you're buying for Apple, that's not what they sell. They sell a unique, unparalleled, uncopied experience to every one of their users. And that is exactly the secret of their success. And that's what iTunes did. In iTunes' first year, it cleared $1 billion. Disney Plus will never get in the black. But iTunes not only was in the black, but they let everything after their first year, and that's the genius of Apple. So this transition will happen. So what do the suppliers do? So they can try to withdraw their efforts. They can attempt to invest ways to counter the negative effects and collaborate. Or you can get bold and launch your own services, buy your own experiences. And I've seen this happen many times. You could almost say that this is where Moody Price took off. And so these are the first things, is the drivers to service. Service is one. The next strategy is globalization. Why are we driven to globalization even if we are warehouses? Well, one big reason is quite simply is we're running out of places to grow. The current population in the United States tends to be aging with decreasing birth rates, increasing competitive rivalries within the US, drives the desire to find new markets for their goods. But guess what? The individuals in developing countries looking for new territories come to the United States as well. And companies such as Aldi, who have very unique ways to do the same things that have been retail forever, are finding new ground in the United States. We're also you're living in the 30 to 40 years after major trade agreements started happening in the 80s and 90s. The North America Free Trade Agreement in 1992 opened all of North America to increase trade. Trade between the United States and Canada, trade between the United States and Mexico, and then of course Canada and Mexico as well. These opening of international markets have allowed the free flow of goods. And then of course the internet has a way to accelerate that international expansion, because when you're on the internet, you're everywhere. And then quite simply, it's because the focus is on globalization as well. We're in a better place. 1996, the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trades, the GATT agreement, also expanded the North American Free Trade Agreement to international markets. Now, there are many international markets, including our own, that have restrictions and tariffs, which is fine. I think that's great. All right. But it doesn't stop organizations from attempting it as well. And all countries are governed by the dynamics within those countries themselves. So every one of those organizations have their own reasons and purposes to exist. And so globalization is a direction, but each of those particular countries have their own right and ability to choose how that happens. And so these are the three drivers of globalization. So in the going into developing markets, there's either success or failure. And you learn a lot more than failure than you do by success, which makes me pretty smart. So it took a shakeout period. And what we learned was, and what other countries learned is that you have to build relationships. Big surprise. You have to go through those key strategic decisions about level of intensity, the selectivity, and find partners to be able to make these global shifts. The top 10 retailers average on selling to at least 16 countries in the world. And so these have shakeout experiences that reverberate across channels, because the question that you ask is, how do I build channels across international boundaries? And so how do we make choices? Well, it depends on how the local market will accept us. And so if you think about the connections that I said together, once again, we're going to acquisition as probably the number one way of being able to get into other countries. In Mexico, you cannot, you cannot move a corporation into Mexico without an associate partner who is willing to sponsor you there. In other words, another corporation there. Great Britain, after World War II, required you that if you were building in Great Britain and bringing businesses, that the revenue generated in Great Britain would stay in Great Britain as well. There's this whole series that's interesting during the 50s and 60s when movies came out. And there was an enormous amount of income that was generated by movies in Great Britain. And they insisted that the revenue generated in Great Britain stay in Great Britain. So that's why if you're a movie buff like I am, you see an enormous number, especially the big budget ones in the 60s, the actors are predominantly British, other than they have brilliant diction. That's another reason why. But that's just one of the natures of ways of doing business, all right? So Tesco started with an acquisition. They entered a joint venture with Samsung. Joint ventures are unique and different. So joint ventures are when two organizations bring half of the individuals and half of the capital together and create a third corporation. That third corporation is owned jointly by the other two companies. Usually they are international in nature and are there designed for a specific purpose. So in 1988, General Motors and Toyota collaborated together to build a factory in California that produced the Toyota Corolla and the Chevy Nova. The Chevy Nova was bolt for bolt the exact same as the Toyota Corolla at that time. And naturally, of course, Toyota outsold the Nova by 5-1. Interestingly enough, that factory was bought by some guy by the name of Elon Musk, and now they're turning out Teslas there. So, win-win situation. Once again, acquisition is the fastest approach. And especially in the international model, because guess what you get? You get local knowledge, you get execution, capacity, capability. It's just the way to do business, folks. I take all the risk. The local partner remains engaged. The local partner generally has some investment in it, or let's just say they're given an investment in it. The local individual has a firsthand knowledge of what's going on, and it allows us to be able to get into even some of the harder, more difficult places to go. Now, there's one last thing also is the franchising model can also be a very good way of making it work as well. International franchising requires something a little different. They have what's called a channel manager, or it also can be a franchise manager. So how does this work? So if I'm looking to franchise internationally, this is generally how it would work. And so I'm just going to draw a very bad picture. And I have an individual in another country. I have one company who is willing to make that investment. They're either a franchise manager or channel manager. Those individuals talk directly to the franchisor. The franchisor, in essence, they are a franchisee. They're making organizations, but because they're a franchise manager, they actually reach out into the country and come up with other franchisees. Okay, they're both a franchisor and a franchisee. They do both of those things, but they act as a representative for corporate in all dealings in that particular country. It's very successful. Works out real well. Took a few years to get that out, but now franchising with its advantages you can find overseas as well. Finally, e-commerce. So I don't have to talk a lot about e-commerce, but what I am going to talk about is that the thrust is accelerating. E-commerce, the omni-channel, your phones are one of the major drivers for growth. This phone and the software that is connected to it is less costly as an infrastructure, and the local staff can be minimal. And that is what makes this little piece of equipment so disruptive. So in 2009, I was teaching a sales class at Louisiana Tech, and I had an old flip phone or a Razor. I can't remember what it was. But anyway, I asked everybody in the class who has a smartphone. This is 2009. Everybody raised their hand. And it was kind of that whack on the side of the head. I realized something had happened and something that was important. Realize this also, folks, that channels back in 2007, when I was getting my degree, 2008, was not the number one top of marketing at that point. Consumer behavior was everything. I was the only individual in my cohort that was considering channels. I came from retail. I still considered it important. I went on the American Marketing Association's website, and I found that the word place was positioned 247th in its listings. So, I mean, even place and channels was not considered rare ground. Look at it now. We're doing 3 classes in channels. Channels is the final frontier of marketing. Of the 4 Ps, we've done product to death, product, price, and promotion to death. All right. Place is the new frontier. And this ultimately is driven by e-commerce. So I'm not going to get hung up on too much on this. Just know that basically it is what I would consider to be a disruptor. All right. It allows relatively small channels and suppliers to have full access to the big markets. It removes a barrier. Businesses can go online very fast. You don't need a large startup investment. You don't even need a proven business model. You can just go out there and do it. And of course, the rise of influencers over the last decade has accelerated this as well. That ability for that one new, unique Mr. Beast to come along and throw everything into a frenzy, or PewDiePie. Just, you know how much people make, by the way, on YouTube? You ever curious? So how do you make money on YouTube? The subscriber base is important. So if you have 1 million subscribers, the average income is $65,000. 1 million subscribers. Scotty Kilmer, who I listen to online, who does work on car things, has 6 million subscribers. So think about how much Scotty Kilmer makes. He's in his 70s, he works on cars, and he's making about 350, 400,000 a year. Now think about Mr. Beast and PewDiePie. That's why they can go on a vacation $1 a day and $1 million a day, and that's how he supports himself. But e-commerce, especially the internet, is a way of making all of these things happen. It causes enormous conflict, all right? Enormous conflict. But you know what? You better get used to it, okay? Each time a channel member comes in, they receive less sales. Think about it as you have more and more ways to go out there and be able to access a good. You have what's called channel pollution. You have cross threads with each other. You have more ways to be able to research a product and ultimately to go out and buy it. And so with all of these things together, it has created a very disruptive, somewhat bold world, okay? So the last thing I'm going to talk about from here is that, yes, there are inequities and there are desires to make connections to local stores, although some do it very miserably. Amazon took over Whole Foods, and that was a baptism by fire. Both of the cultures within those organizations simply aren't like each other. But Amazon did it because they know fully and realize that retail is another location that they could expand to. For years, Amazon has danced around Kohl's, K-O-H-L-S, department store, and thought about buying it. And the reason why is quite simply to get access, to be able to have other retail locations. Now, you might argue, why would Amazon care? And the obvious reason is there's a lot more they're giving up to Walmart than they're willing to admit. The difficulty, of course, is free riding is there. You know, the ability of going to one location to be able to get the knowledge and go to another location to get the good brings that on. So I'm not going to talk about any of these other things, and I'm moving on finally to the discussion in the multi-channel. So if we were to look at Walmart over the last 20 years, Walmart has recognized what Amazon has done to their business model and said to themselves, either we join them or we don't, and we lose. What Walmart has recognized is that there are market segments out there that they are not targeting because, quite simply, they don't have the channels to reach them. The Walmart side originally was just purely informative. And so what Walmart decided is they've got to create an online channel. But more than just that. They had their retail outlets. They were starting an online store. There also has to be better ways to deliver the goods. And so, as you remember in chapter 2, where you would drive up and the goods would be put into your car, that's a new channel. The ability to buy online and pick up in store was actually written about in 2008, but did not actually come into fruition when we had the COVID hit and there needed to be more than one outlet. And so deciding which new channels to make in the existing mix is the first step. And then ultimately where you go from there is deciding how they all work together. So if we're to look at Walmart in 2014, Walmart actually made a smart choice. They do it every once in a while. In 2014, Walmart bought Jet.com. Now, this is before I can't believe 2014 is time, but it is. Jet.com was a corporation where the CEO created what's called dynamic search engine. And so you would go in, look for a particular good, and Jet.com search engine would go out to all the other websites and find the lowest price of that particular good. Walmart bought it, took the CEO of Jet, made him their CIO in charge of the internet, and then Walmart started buying different stuff. And the reason you buy different stuff is because you're selling different stuff. So they bought Voodoo, they sold it in 2021. They bought Moose Jaw, which is outdoor recreation. Flipkart is the Indian e-commerce. And they bought Shoebuy, which is now shoes.com. They sell something like 30 million shoes a year out of shoe.com, shoes.com. Jet.com, of course, has been retired. It's out. But Walmart decided that they were going to invest heavily in the multi-channel, and it has been to their enormous success. Walmart has had double-digit growth over the last decade. They continue to do so. Online, I think it's like 20% of all sales in Walmart are now online, and that's an extraordinary number. They actually made Amazon change their prime standards, especially when it came to shipping, because they knew they were in a world of hurt, because Walmart had 45 retail outlets across the United States, all of those places where you get your goods if you want it. And so this is an example of the multi-channel. Now, it's important also to understand the multi-channel is siloed, all right? In other words, each one of these organizations does not interact with each other. And that's what the multi-channel does. The omni-channel comes along and blows everybody away. So, when I bought my 75-inch television, when I got tenure, and didn't tell my wife, well, I did, but she didn't know how big it was. She loves it now. But anyway, when I started looking, the first thing I did was I started looking online. I started going to multiple websites, determining what was the actual best picture. I went to Samsung, went to LG, looked at theirs, decided on a Samsung, and then I had to walk in the store to actually look at it, because 60% of people buy electronics online, but of those people, nearly 2/3 of us has to actually look at it, okay? This is an example of pollution that happens in the channel environment and where free riding happens, because as a consumer, I'm in control. And that's what the omni-channel does. And so in this seminal article, and I'm not going to try to say his name because I'll butcher it. So they said in the past, brick and mortar retail stores were unique in allowing consumers to touch and feel merchandise and provide instant gratification. Internet retailers, meanwhile, tried to woo shoppers with wide product selections, low prices, and content such as product reviews and ratings. As the retailing industry evolves towards a seamless omni-channel retailing experience, the distinctions between physical and online will vanish, turning the world into a showroom without walls. And that's what the omni-channel does. It breaks down the connections, not only within the corporations themselves, but literally across the internet. All you have to do is go into Google Shopping and type in one good, and Google Shopper will do the same thing that Jet.com does. Omni-channel breaks the barriers. It moves past the restrictions and allows the consumer to ultimately take total control of their purchase and deliveries. And that's the glory of the omni-channel. And retailers can either accept it or they can get run over. Now, I want you to look at this particular slide because I think this is important to understand. The multi-channel is the connection between online, print, and digital. It is all of those organizations listed together. But it's important to understand that although you see these things together, they never overlap. The multi-channel, each channel is siloed. The omni-channel starts in the middle with the consumer. The consumer does their research. They look at the particular products. They come up with their consideration set of those particular items that they might buy. They make their final evaluations. They make their purchases and decide whether to get it delivered or whether to go and get it or have it in some other form. By the way, my 75-inch television I actually bought from Walmart because the delivery allowed the Walmart person to actually come directly to my house, and God bless him, he actually helped me carry it inside. Thank you. He didn't have to do that. So anyway, this is the difference between the omni-channel. Now, test question. What is the difference between the omni-channel and the multi-channel? This is the answer. The multi-channel is customer-centric. It considers the customer in all of their aspects, but generally the wherewithal is driven by the corporations. The omni-channel is customer-driven. The omni-channel exists because its consumers are the ones who initiated it. The service supplied was less than the service demanded. Consumers wanted a better way to shop. They created applications independent of the places that were selling the goods or the manufacturers themselves. And when consumers came up with things like, anybody have Gas Buddy, by the way, on their phone? I have Gas Buddy. It looks up the cheapest price of gas on the road, so I know where the best prices are. That's just an app. The app was not created by any one of the gas stations themselves. That's an independent organization. By the very same function, Jet was independent, Google is independent, all of those. And eventually what happens is the organizations either get on the bandwagon because the consumers are driving that, or they'll be left by the wayside. And multi-channel retailing is moving to omni-channel retailing, and probably multi-channel retailing is just a new transition step. I talk about it now because it's kind of important for you to understand the relationship between the two, that multi-channel did exist, but it isn't the ultimate goal that omni-channel is. The omni-channel brings one app to rule them all, one app to find them, and in the darkness find them if you're a Lord of the Rings fan. Anyway, so the omni-channel versus the multi-channel. And so just remember, the e-commerce is the biggest factor in disrupting channel structures and strategies today. It will allow suppliers to directly sell to customers without the intermediaries. It's a driver of disintermediation. It removes many of the barriers of past entry, which means it's leading to an ever larger fragmented market. Because as we know more about the consumers, which is driven by their shopping in the omni-channel apps that they're using, we're getting a greater understanding of our consumer desires and when those desires change. And so, what is the solution? Is that suppliers and channel members need to come up with their own strategies. This even includes wholesalers that only sell to retailers because retailers are the next step to the consumers. And so I've actually seen this, my family are dairy farmers in Florence, Mississippi. And so it has come to this point now where when their tanks fill with milk, they can hit a button on their app and delivery will come there the next day. Not only that, but you can see the truck, just like Uber, you can see the truck on the map coming to their location. So there's no need to call or to ask. It is genius. All right. And this is just one of those ways making things better than they were. And so that is it with chapter 9. All right. Remember the 3 major emerging structures and strategies. Remember services and their definitions. Remember the drivers to globalization. Remember the disruption of e-commerce, and definitely remember that definition between the difference in multi-channel and non-channel. Okay. All right, folks. Have a good weekend. I hope you have a good one in the rain. Take care.